Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is flight instructor and YouTube pilot Martin Pauly. He talks about modern engine management, a new generation of autopilots, and flying in a B-29. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello pilots, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to all 82 episodes of Pilot's Discretion. And send us an email with your comments or guest ideas, podcast@sporties.com. Today, my guest is Martin Pauly. He could be described in many ways, but most listeners will know him from his popular YouTube channel, where for over a decade he has shared practical flying tips from the left seat of his Bonanza. His day job is also in the aviation industry, where he works in product strategy and software engineering. Martin is a flight instructor specializing in Bonanzas and a longtime glider pilot as well. Martin, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
Let's start with engine management. In my opinion, a criminally underrated topic in pilot training. You have some great videos on this, especially on the topic of lean of peak operation. It's, I think, many pilots' go-to video for understanding what lean of peak is all about. And we'll link to that video so listeners can get the background. But let's start with why this matters. What is the point of running lean of peak anyway?
Yeah, the main goal that people try to achieve with lean of peak is twofold. It's to run the engine cooler cylinder head temperatures, and to save fuel, right? Fuel is expensive, and if we can complete a cross-country trip with quite a few gallons less consumed, that's a good thing. That's money left for a nice meal or some other fun things. As a side effect of that, you also increase your range, and because your fuel flow is lower, and that might actually allow you to complete a trip faster by eliminating a fuel stop. You might have a slightly lower airspeed and ground speed, but if you can get to your destination without a fuel stop, you still are there faster than if you had flown richer peak.
And so if I'm calculating this, is it really about miles per gallon? Just like in a car, I'm going to maybe suffer a little bit of a speed hit, but I'm going to increase my efficiency?
That's exactly it, yeah. Just like the gas mileage in the car, miles per gallon, some engine monitors even have a readout for that miles per gallon. As you move the mixture knob, you can see how the miles per gallon changes and how that affects your fuel economy.
Now, this is not a binary thing, right? I mean, there are times perhaps I would want to run rich of peak or lean of peak. This is not something I have to commit to once in my flying career and never change. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So whenever you want the best power, for example, on takeoff or climb, you can run rich of peak, and that gives you the best horsepower. When you want the best miles per gallon, the best economy, then you can lean back to a mixture setting on the lean side of peak. But it's also perfectly fine on a given flight if speed is more important than the cost of the fuel for that flight to cruise rich of peak. So there's no right or wrong there. It's whatever your optimization criteria is for a given flight.
Is it different from airplane to airplane? I sometimes hear pilots talk about, you can't run a old Cessna 182 with an 0470 lean of peak, but a Bonanza with an IO 550 and game ejectors runs just fine. Is that true?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. If for just a minute we look at just what's going on inside one cylinder, the combustion that takes place there, you control the air and fuel that goes into that cylinder, and the cylinder doesn't know if that air and fuel came through some fuel injection system or a carburetor or however it ended up there, right? It just burns, and the fuel to air ratio then dictates how that all unfolds, and it can be lean of peak or rich of peak. Where we get into problems sometimes is that we have in all our engines in aircraft multiple cylinders connected to the same crankshaft. And as much as the designers of the engines try to have the same amount of fuel and air in each cylinder for each combustion event, for practical reasons, that's just not happening. And for example, in carbureted engines, there's a lot of variability from cylinder to cylinder, and that can make it difficult to run lean of peak without getting so much roughness in the engine that it's really not practical. To a lesser extent, that variability exists in fuel-injected engines as well. And in fuel-injected engines, there are ways to improve the balance from cylinder to cylinder with fuel injectors like the GAM ejectors. And once you have that balance between your 4 or 6 or however many cylinders you have, then there's really nothing preventing you from running lean of peak.
How important is a digital engine monitor here? You talked about, to me, one piece of the puzzle here, the injectors in this case and the balanced fuel getting to the cylinders. Can I do lean of peak without a multi-point engine monitor like a JPI or a Garmin EIS?
I think the better question is, would you know whether you are lean of peak or not? And to illustrate that, many of us have learned to lean and cruise by pulling the mixture knob back until we get a little roughness, right? And then push it back just a little bit. And if I do that in the average, 1960s 172 trainer that many flight schools have, I'm probably going to be rich of peak or have some cylinders that are lean of peak and others that are rich of peak. If I do that in my Bonanza or in many other fuel-injected aircraft, I'm going to be on the lean of peak side. Whether I have an engine monitor that tells me that or not, right? The engine doesn't know that it's being monitored. So that leads to something that I find quite ironic, that sometimes people tell me, I never run lean of peak. I just pull back until roughness and then I enrich it. And I bet you many of these people are actually running lean of peak. They just don't know it because they don't have the instrumentation of the engine that would tell them that.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, I think the engine monitor is overlooked by a lot of pilots. Once you fly with one, you realize how much you're missing without it. And
Yes.
Especially the old one little EGT needle tells you very, very little about what's actually happening in that engine.
I agree. And I would even argue that on the rich of peak side, an engine monitor is just as valuable because it can alert you if something isn't quite right. For example, if you have a partially clogged fuel injector just on one cylinder, then that one cylinder operating rich of peak with the engine could be a lot hotter with a lot higher internal pressures than the other cylinders. And unless you have a CHT probe on that one cylinder, you would never know about it, right? If you have a single probe CHT and EGT on a single cylinder, then all you know is what one cylinder is doing, but you're kind of flying blind on the others. So a digital engine monitor that has CHT and EGT for each cylinder individually is a really, really good investment, whether you fly rich of peak or lean of peak.
You've mentioned CHT a few times, which is a topic that most owners of high-performance airplanes know all about and closely monitor. Lots of advice out there about keeping CHTs below 400 or 420 degrees. Let's back up and explain why CHT matters, because, again, I think a lot of pilots learn to fly, like you said, in the late 60s, 172. The engine instruments include oil pressure, oil temperature, and maybe an EGT single-point needle that may or may not work, based on my experience. So
Right.
as they step up into a Bonanza or a Cirrus or a 210 or something, that may be the first time they see a CHT gauge. Why is that such an important topic, and why should we really care more about that than EGT in most cases?
Yeah, we should care about all those things, right? But let's assume that it is the new gauge that you just see for the first time in a new airplane. Let's think about what can damage an engine and or any kind of machinery that's made of metal. And two of the prime things that come to mind are heat and pressure. Why? Well, heat, if you warm things up, if you warm metal up, it loses its strength. Aluminum in particular, and some of the engine components are made of aluminum. Pressure, Well, it's obvious. If you apply mechanical pressure on something often enough and strongly enough, then eventually you get to a breaking point. So heating things up and then applying pressure to them is bad for any kind of machinery, and that includes our aircraft engines. The CHT, the cylinder head temperature, is the actual temperature of the metal of that cylinder. The exhaust gas is also there. It's usually much hotter than the CHT, but it's just gas and it goes overboard anyway, right? So it doesn't do any damage per se to the engine. But if the metal, the CHT, the cylinder temperature, gets too hot, that means components of the engine are now weaker than they would be at a lower temperature. At the same time, CHT is a good proxy for yet another parameter for which we don't have a gauge in the cockpit, even with the most advanced engine monitors, and that is the internal pressure that builds up inside the cylinder. That peaks during combustion as the flame front makes it through the cylinder and the air and gas burns. That pressure rapidly rises, and that peak pressure, if that is too large, then it can create damage. So it so happens that CHT is a good proxy for the internal cylinder pressure. We don't have a pressure gauge, but if we look at the CHT, we can kind of get an idea of whether that pressure is rising or declining. And the remedy is quite simple. Avoid running the engine in a setup where CHTs are high. And then that way you avoid both the high temperatures and the high pressures, and you keep everything in a healthy area.
And so what are some ways to do that? Obviously, we've been talking about mixture control, but there are multiple ways. So if I'm chasing a hot CHT and I'm worried, what should be in my tool bag of options?
Yeah, mixture control is the most effective one. If you're on takeoff at a sea-level airport and your CHTs are too high, well, maybe your fuel flow or your engine setup, your fuel system setup is such that it doesn't produce the fuel pressure and fuel flow that is needed by that engine to keep it cool, right? Rich of peak, fuel is our friend, and by adding a little more fuel and making an adjustment maybe to the fuel pump to increase the fuel pressure can help. Cooling can also help, so making sure that the baffles are in good shape is good, or increasing airspeed is good. However, that could mask a problem with the pressures, right? For example, if we fly on a nice cold winter day, the CHTs might look just fine, but it's only because there's so much cool air from the outside available to cool the cylinders. The pressures, the internal cylinder pressures, are still going to be high, so we don't want to be too comfortable on a winter day with CHTs around 380 or so, right? What else? Timing of the magnetos of the ignition system could be a problem. But yeah, those are then things that require the help of a mechanic. It's really the mixture control, really, and controlling airspeed and power in general that the pilot can control to get a handle on CHTs.
Another topic you talk about a lot on your YouTube channel is avionics, new avionics. You've got a great panel on your Bonanza, but it's like many airplanes these days in that it's a mix of parts. You've got Aspen primary flight displays, Garmin navigators, Garmin autopilot, digital engine monitor. So how do you learn the different pieces of a panel like that, which are very common these days? Can you learn that from a book or a simulator, or do you need to go flying and you need to go flying with an expert in that aircraft? What should a pilot who's about to install a lot of avionics, what should I go do to actually learn all that new stuff?
Yeah, great question, and I wish there was an easy answer to to accomplish that. But pilots learn in different ways, right? And what works for me might not work for you or somebody listening to this podcast here. The most important message, though, that I think is universally true, is that these new avionics systems, especially the new autopilots, are a lot more complex than the instrumentation that they typically replace. So some investment is necessary in understanding how they work and how to best operate them. And for some people, that might be spending a week with the manuals, and then they might be ready for it. For others, it might be flying with an instructor or flying with a friend who already has that avionics equipment and seeing how it works. What doesn't work is to just hop in the flight and try to figure it out during an actual flight, right? Because the complexity of these components, what they can do and how to operate them is enormous. And
yeah, the commitment to training is the key piece. That whatever it is, do
Yes.
something. A lot of manufacturers have online training. We have some courses at Sporty's online. You can go to the Garmin factory and do in-person training. Whatever it is, as long as you're doing something, I think you're 100% right. And you mentioned the autopilot, which I know you just did a Garmin autopilot upgrade. I'm flying an airplane right now that has one of the new Garmin autopilots. And I know I underestimated at first how different the new autopilot generation is, in a good way. They're incredibly impressive.
Right.
Autopilots have all kinds of features, from level buttons to smart glide, you name it. Talk a little bit about why that is different and takes a different approach. If I grew up flying a KAP 140 or KFC 225 or something like that, and I've got a new GFC 500, what's the biggest difference you've noticed?
Yeah, compared with the early autopilots, and maybe to help explain it, we can go even back one level beyond those that you mentioned. Say a wing leveler, right? There's one button, on and off, and when you want the autopilot to work, you turn it on, and then it levels the wings, and you understand what it does and how that is helpful and how that is also limited, and then you use it. Above that is something a little more advanced where you maybe have a heading bug and you can now select a heading. And that is maybe the first example of how it's not just about that autopilot panel that is somewhere in your airplane, but there's another component in your directional gyro or HSI that is connected to the autopilot. What we find in today's systems is that this connection is now much more complex, and there's many other pieces in the panel that the autopilot is connected to. A heading bug, an altitude target, maybe an indicated airspeed target. And it's not intuitively obvious what all is connected, right? Unless you read the manuals or get some instruction or watch a video course, how would you know, right? And the complexity, therefore, is not just in the autopilot panel. It still looks pretty simple in most cases. It has just a few push buttons and knobs, but in all the other things that the autopilot interacts with to do its job. And that, I think, explains the complexity, right? There's a lot beyond that autopilot panel in today's autopilots, in addition to the more complex mode logic with an active mode and an armed mode, right? None of that existed in the very early autopilots.
Yeah, it's a great point that a lot of times an autopilot is paired to a new primary flight display, in which you're going to have sort of that scoreboard at the top, and learning to understand what's reflected on the PFD should match what's reflected on the autopilot panel. That may be a new scenario for pilots who aren't used to flying with that, but is an essential part of, as you mentioned, the idea of an active mode and an armed mode may be new. And there's only more of those. I notice with a lot of these autopilots, you can have vertical, VNAV armed and all kinds of other modes. Right. So again, a vote for training.
Yeah, for the autopilot modes, for example, one particular gotcha for some popular autopilots is that when you fly an ILS approach, that starts with some GPS guidance to get onto the final approach course. Upon switching from GPS to V-log, the autopilot goes from nav to roll mode, basically wings level. So it's important to understand when that happens, under what conditions, so that you can anticipate it and be ready to re-engage nav mode. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that many of these new autopilots have a tool which I find is highly underutilized, and that's a flight director. It allows you to still hand fly and stay sharp with those hand flying skills, but use the brain of the autopilot to do its computation and help, for example, with when to start intercepting a localizer or a final approach course of an LPV approach, so that upon completion of that turn, you're really established and avoid those S-turns around it. So for anyone who is installing one of these new modern digital autopilots, I would suggest to look at the flight director and use it whenever possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. The flight director is overlooked by many, many pilots. It's not all or nothing. You have multiple levels of automation, autopilot, or just flight director. So an excellent point, and another vote for getting some training. Martin, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, let's talk about YouTube.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses, so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at sportys.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at sportys.com/pilot training or visit the Sportys tent at AirVenture right in front of Hangar B. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Martin Pauly, who is one of the original YouTube pilots, at least in my book. Martin, you've been on YouTube now for over a decade, which seems like a long time in that world. What has changed in that time? Either the platform, the audience, the technology? What's different now than when you first started?
Yeah, a lot of little things have changed that add up to maybe a different world. First of all, 10 years ago, it was in 2013 that I published my first video on YouTube for flying. There were very few aviation channels on YouTube, right? Which, looking back, you might wonder, why? Because there were many pilots, and the interest probably was there as well. But what it meant for me was that it was actually possible to publish videos and grow the channel, and that's a lot harder if you wanted to try the same thing today, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of aviation channels out there on YouTube, and probably as many podcasts that are all competing for viewers' time. So for anyone starting out fresh today, I imagine it must be much, much harder to get a break and be recognized and get those view and subscriber numbers that every channel would like to see.
And how do you avoid the urge to make clickbait? You do such a great job of listening on your channel. You have really helpful, practical tips, engine monitoring, avionics, instrument proficiency. I don't ever see you with, crazy death-defying tricks. How do you continue to make those videos and resist that urge? Because it's there, as you allude to, that the competition is fierce.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think the key is to not see it as a competition, but to find what it is that you're passionate about, and then make videos about those things. And if your passion is about airplane accidents and trying to explain what might have happened, then so be it. By all means, those are not necessarily bad channels, but that's not what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about instrument flying, I have this weird, unexplainable addiction of flying my Bonanza to large airports. So I like doing that, and I document it, and I love sharing what I've learned in many years of flying with others. I do that as a flight instructor, and I try to do that in my YouTube channel. And how many people I reach with it, how many subscribers I get, that's secondary. Right? I think if you're not passionate about what you're creating, whether it's YouTube or TV or podcasts or writing books, then people will know it, and it likely won't be successful.
Yeah, the authenticity is the word that comes to mind for me,
Yes.
and that's what comes through. Is it's not forced, it's not fake, it's what you're interested in, and you can sense that. Do you worry about making mistakes on camera, though? You're, as you mentioned, recording yourself doing some complicated things sometimes, flying in real weather and going to busy airports. Do you worry about the camera always being over your shoulder?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't worry about it too much, and maybe I should worry about it more. But first of all, if something goes really, really wrong in my flight, right, I have the option of not turning that into a video. But maybe more importantly, if something goes wrong and I recognize it and recover from it in flight, there's a learning opportunity there. Certainly it was for me during the flight, and maybe it'll help others by recognizing that it's normal to make mistakes. The key is to be diligent, watch out for them, recognize them, and come up with strategies to recover and mitigate them. And if there were ever something that would be cause for concern, like an altitude deviation, or I fly a procedure wrong or something like this, right? I would hope that the authorities or whoever might see that looks or weighs that learning opportunity and value against the momentary deviation here, right? Up to a point. I'm not saying that should be an excuse to do anything I want. Absolutely not, right? But the reality is that no flight is perfect, right? We can always do better, and I think it would be unrealistic to show a flight that has zero mistakes and zero room for improvement.
Okay, Martin, we always finish Pilot's Discretion with a lightning round called Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
You fly a Bonanza, as you mentioned, airplane with a legendary reputation and a passionate following. What is it that makes owners so loyal? Is it the handling, the look, the history, the way it's built? Why do you think the Bonanza endures?
I think it's the perfect compromise. All airplanes are compromises, right? Unless money is completely unlimited. But you have a budget, you have performance, you have build quality, you have roominess of the cabin and comfort, and the Bonanza is like it's not the best in any of these categories, but it's a really good compromise to do well in all of them. And I think that has made them so successful for so many decades.
You started flying in Germany. So what is something that we American pilots take for granted that we shouldn't?
An easy example is the ability to take off from an uncontrolled airfield without talking to anyone, without there being somebody who's a designee from the government on the ground recording your takeoff, that the field is open 24/7. Yeah, we take that for granted. You just got to cross any border in any direction, and it's not like that elsewhere.
If a listener is flying with a GoPro, what's a simple tip for making better flying videos?
Oh, we could fill an hour with
You have to pick one.
Yeah. Don't go for the highest resolution and highest bit rate. Turn it down a little bit. It helps with battery life, and it helps with preventing overheating. The other thing is, when you change when you set up the color profile, I believe it's called, or what they call it, ProTune in the GoPro, set the color to flat and not the vibrant colors that we all know from the GoPro commercials. But if you set it to flat, it gives the camera a more dynamic range. And we deal with a lot of situations in flying that are challenging for dynamic range, like a very bright picture outside through the window when part of the frame is something inside, a person or the instrument panel. And using that flat setting gives you something that looks like a very dull image at first glance, but it actually has more information in it. So with the editing tools, you can then refine it and make it look equally good for the darker portions that are inside the cockpit and the brighter portions that are outside the window.
Excellent tips. I know you got to fly in Doc, one of the few remaining B-29s that still flies. I'm incredibly jealous of that. Describe that experience to us in, 10 words or less. How would you sum that up?
It was awe-inspiring to see the complexity of the flight engineer station there. I'm going beyond 10 words, I know.
It's okay. It's a fancy airplane.
That's probably where the biggest difference is between the B-29 and most modern airplanes today. The job of the flight engineer in a high-performance, large piston aircraft of those days was amazing. And I don't think these people got enough credit for what they did.
Other than your channel, do you have a favorite pilot on YouTube? Somebody you like to watch who does a good job?
Good question. I don't watch much or listen much on a regular basis. I do, however, have a number of peers or colleagues, if you will, in the YouTube community that have become close friends over the years. And but even then, I don't watch every video that they make. I do immensely look forward to seeing them at events like AirVenture or Sun and Fun, where we can chat and catch up and have a drink or even go flying together. But no, there's not anyone that I religiously watch every time they make a new video.
You've done some flying in the Bahamas, which is a pilot's paradise, a place I love to fly as well. What's your favorite place to visit down there?
I've only done one flight so far, and that was to Bimini. So yeah, out of all the places I've been to, Bimini has been my favorite. But it has created an appetite for more. We picked Bimini because it was so close to the shore and not knowing how we'd feel over so much water. It was, I think, a good first one to go to. And now that we enjoyed that and flying was not a problem, we're ready to explore more.
What is an autopilot scenario every pilot should practice? If I'm going for a flight review or an IPC, I've got one of these fancy new autopilots we talked about. What's something I should practice with my instructor?
I'll give you two. One is, and I mentioned this earlier, the transition from GPS guidance to VOR or localizer. Know what your autopilot does and doesn't do there, and then be ready to take over. The other one is initiating the missed approach. Some autopilots can do that fully coupled. Others you have to disconnect and reprogram. But think about that ahead of time. And it should be part of the approach briefing to say, okay, if we go missed, I'm going to hit toga and push the right rudder and or whatever is required for your setup.
Perhaps related, what's a good way to build real-world IFR experience? Something you mentioned, you like to do IFR flying. I like to do that as well. There's a difference between getting the rating and being able to do it. So how do I safely expand my envelope?
There are lots of ways to do that. One is you could simply do it by yourself and seek gradually more challenging trips or conditions that you fly in. There are a lot of examples of IFR flights, cross-country flights on YouTube, on channels like mine, where you see how it really works and not the check rides or the instrument training, right? For example, it may be surprising to most people who just passed their instrument check ride that most instrument flights don't end in an instrument approach, but in a visual approach, right? Those are the kinds of things you learn over time. Or fly with a friend who is an experienced instrument pilot and see how things work in real life. Another thing that comes to mind is that some of these typical real life things are regional. Flying instruments in the Midwest is different from the East Coast and different from California or South Florida. So when you plan a trip to an area, part of the country that you haven't been to before, reach out to somebody who lives there, who knows the differences and can give you a little bit of an overview. And that is even more true if you fly internationally.
Great advice. I know you began your aviation career in gliders. So what's a skill you learned flying gliders that's particularly useful for flying airplanes? Assuming the engine keeps running, is there a skill that makes you a better airplane pilot?
I think the number one thing is I know what the rudder is for.
Yep.
Or I know additional things that the rudder is for other than you're compensating the left turning tendencies on takeoff and climb. I find that people that learn in airplanes, in tricycle gear airplanes, that is, typically don't use the rudder other than to keep the airplane centered. Maybe I'm less nervous about the possibility of an engine out, because I have over 1,000 engine out landings in my book, granted with higher performing gliders, but the mindset is, this has to work because there's no second chance. And while that doesn't guarantee that, if I were to have an engine issue in my Bonanza, that I could get to a good landing site, it probably takes a little bit of the nervousness out of it.
Our last question's always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Oh, I could think of lots of airplanes that I would love to fly sometime, but I think in my final flight, I'd want to do it in November 7th, the Tango Bravo, my Bonanza. Hard to imagine that there'll ever be another airplane that I'll be so familiar with and will have created so many memories with than the Bonanza I currently own. And I would love to take it to I'll pick Innsbruck in Austria, one of my most memorable flights from when I lived in Germany. Just the scenery there is fantastic, and that will be a nice end to a flying career if it has to end one day.
Yeah, it's an airport that's famous for many pilots because of Flight Simulator, so it looks great in the sim. I'm sure it looks even more impressive in person.
It's spectacular, yes.
Martin, thanks for being on the podcast.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me, John.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.